For years, Captain Luis Angel Araya had refused to fly unsafe aircraft. He'd say it openly, right to his boss's faces. On March 17, 2025, he called his wife and told her the plane had engine trouble, but just a few hours later, he was back in the cockpit. 30 seconds after takeoff, 17 people were plunged into the dark waters of the Caribbean just off the coast of Roatán. 12 of them wouldn't make it out alive. Almost a year later, the black box is still down there. So why did a pilot who knew the truth decide to fly? And why is no one trying to pull the answers from the seabed? In 1989, at the British Aerospace plant in Prestwick, Scotland, a small turboprop aircraft, serial number 863, is rolling off the assembly line. It's a Jetstream 32, 2 Honeywell engines, 19 passenger seats, and a cockpit so tight the pilots are practically rubbing elbows. The plane is compact, it's loud, and for the late 80s, it's considered pretty modern. Its first owner is Trans World Express, a regional subsidiary of the legendary TWA. The aircraft gets an American registration and starts flying short routes within the states. What happens to it next is a mystery. For the following 27 years, the plane is flying somewhere, being maintained by someone, making money for someone, but not a single public source names any of its interim operators. 27 years of its life. Just a complete blank. Then, in August of 2017, the plane resurfaces in a completely different part of the world. It now has a Honduran registration, HR-AYW, and flies for a small airline called Lanhsa, Línea Aérea Nacional de Honduras. Lanhsa is based in the port city of Ceiba on the Caribbean coast, and it ferries passengers to the nearby islands, Roatán, Utila, and Guanaja, short hops over the warm sea, 20 to 30 minutes from shore to shore. By March of 2025, aircraft 863 is 35 and a half years old. How many hours it's flown, how many takeoff and landing cycles it's been through, that information has never been published, not by the airline, not by the regulator, not in any report. What we do know is that in January of 2025, HRAYW passed an inspection and received a fresh certificate of airworthiness. On paper, everything is fine, but the Jetstream 31/32 has a reputation you won't find in any official paperwork. This aircraft has been involved in a whole series of disasters, many of which follow the same script. They happen right after lifting off the runway. In December of 1994, a Jetstream 32 crashes in North Carolina. The crew misidentifies which engine has failed, shuts down the good one, and 15 people die. In October of 2004, another Jetstream 32 hits the trees on approach in Missouri after the crew had been on duty for 14 hours, 13 dead. And in January of 2024, just 14 months before the events in Honduras, a Canadian Northwestern Airjet, Stream 32, goes down 500 meters from the runway in Fort Smith, right after takeoff. 6 dead, 1 survivor. When a plane is 35 years old and its type keeps showing up in accident reports, the question isn't whether it's airworthy on paper. The question is, what stands behind that paperwork? And here's what makes this particular aircraft so treacherous. The Honeywell TPE-331 engine, installed on all Jetstream 32s, has one nasty design quirk. In an RPM range between 18 and 28%, it enters a zone of what's called harmonic vibration. To put it simply, it starts to shake, resonating with its own components. The manufacturer requires pilots to pass through this zone quickly, without lingering, at least 1% RPM per second. If the engine gets stuck in this range, the vibrations can cause internal damage. But the real trap isn't the vibration. It's how the instrument panel tells the pilots about a failure. The Jetstream 32 has an ignition indicator light, ING. It's supposed to light up when the engine is starting and go out once it reaches operating speed. The problem is, this light can give a false positive. If a pilot moves the propeller control levers to a high RPM setting while the throttle is low, the light can flash on, even though the engine is running perfectly fine. The pilot sees a warning that isn't real. The manufacturer is aware of this and has issued a special notice to all operators. The main point can be boiled down to a single sentence. The only reliable way to know if an engine is running is to look at the RPM gauge, not the ignition light, not the torque readings, not the gas temperature, only the RPMs. Everything else can lie. This is the exact trap that sprung in Raleigh-Durham back in December of 1994. The crew saw false indications of a failure in one engine and decided to shut it down. Only they shut down the wrong one. The healthy engine went silent, while the damaged one was left as the sole source of thrust, and it wasn't enough. At low altitude, with one engine out, the Jetstream doesn't give you a second chance. The asymmetric thrust yaws the plane instantly. The airspeed drops below a controllable level, and from that point on, there's nothing a pilot can do. 2 years earlier, in 1992, a training flight in Prestwick, at the very factory where the Jetstream is built, confirmed this. An instructor simulates an engine failure after takeoff. The trainee pilot tries to handle it and loses control. The training session ends with the plane hitting the ground, killing both pilots. A training flight, a controlled environment, an experienced instructor right there, and it was still a disaster. And in January of 2022, Lanhsa itself gets a direct warning, though of a different kind. Its Jetstream 31, registration HR-AYY, is on approach to the same runway 07 at Roatán Airport when its right landing gear collapses. The plane veers off the runway. The 20 people on board are unharmed, but the aircraft is written off. It's not a catastrophe. It's a wake-up call. The question is, who's listening? At the controls of this plane is a man who knows more about it than he'd like to. Luis Angel Araya is 52, and his career path reads like a map of half the globe. He was born in Nicaragua, grew up in Ceiba, Honduras, and then his career took him on a loop across the world. First, India, with Kingfisher Airlines, the one founded by billionaire Vijay Mallya that eventually went bankrupt. Then, Indonesia with Wings Abadi Airlines, flying over the islands of Southeast Asia. Then back to Central America, Taka, Sosa, and finally, Lanhsa. Over 16,000 hours in the air. That's nearly 2 full years of his life, spent between the sky and the ground. And Araya isn't the kind of pilot who just quietly does what he's told. His friend Fausto Molina would later tell reporters from La Prensa in no uncertain terms. The captain had repeatedly refused to fly missions because he considered the equipment unsafe. He complained about the maintenance of the planes he was forced to fly. Not anonymously, not in a whisper, but openly, to management's face. For a pilot at a small airline in a small country, that's the kind of move that can cost you your job. But Araya did it anyway, more than once. Next to him in the right-hand seat is Francisco Lagos, the first officer. We know much less about him. Young, from Tegucigalpa, he moved to La Ceiba after getting the job with Lanhsa. He has a commercial pilot license, a step below Captain Araya's airline transport pilot license. How many hours Lagos has flown in total, or specifically on the Jetstream, has never been published. Just hours before the crash, he posts a photo on social media. The caption reads, "Back to work." He'd just gotten back from a vacation in Colombia. Both pilots have current medical certificates. Araya's is valid until August of 2025. Lagos's until January of 2026. On paper, both are healthy, both are certified, and both are authorized to take this plane into the air. But paper doesn't record one thing: how many times the captain of this flight had said these planes were not in the condition they should be, and how many times his words had no effect. March 17th, 2025, a Monday, starts early for this crew, and far from Roatán. Araya and Lagos take off from La Ceiba and head southeast along the Caribbean coast toward Puerto Lempira. It's a tiny town on the Mosquito Coast, one of the most remote regions in Central America. There are almost no roads, so for the locals, a plane isn't a luxury. It's the only way to reach the mainland in a reasonable amount of time. HR-AYW lands in Puerto Lempira, and this is where the first event that people would later recall again and again takes place. During a stopover, a problem is found with the hydraulic system in one of the engines. The flight is delayed for about 30 minutes while the crew or ground staff perform some kind of maintenance and test runs. What kind exactly is unknown. What was specifically wrong with the hydraulics is unknown. Who did the work and whether they were properly certified is also unknown. Puerto Lempira isn't an international hub with hangars and certified repair shops. It's a dirt strip on the edge of the jungle. At that moment, Captain Araya does what any normal person in his position would do. He calls his wife. Claudia Maria Sanchez, a former flight attendant for TACA, understands aviation terminology well. Her husband tells her the plane has engine trouble, not had trouble, has trouble. This phone call would later become a key piece of evidence for the journalists at La Prensa. After the 30-minute delay, HRAYW takes off again. The second leg, Puerto Lempira back to La Ceiba, is completed with no recorded incidents. The third leg, from La Ceiba across the strait to the island of Roatán, is also uneventful. 2 consecutive flights with no complaints, no log entries, no delays. You might think the problem was fixed, or you might think it just hadn't shown itself again. Yet, by evening, the crew is preparing for their 4th flight of the day. The route, Roatán back to La Ceiba, 35 nautical miles over the Caribbean Sea. The flight number, 018. This flight number is about to become known all across Honduras. As the crew wraps up their final checks, passengers are gathering inside the Roatán airport terminal, and for many of them, it's the same story. They're here because they missed the ferry. Juan Manuel Galvez Airport sits practically at sea level, just 6 meters above the water. Runway 07/25, just over 2 kilometers long, starts at the base of the hills and ends right where the tarmac drops off into the Caribbean Sea. When a plane barrels down runway 07, heading east, all you see through the windshield is water and the horizon. Flight 018 is scheduled for 5:40 p.m. But a delay is announced to the passengers. First, they say it'll be 25 minutes. In the end, the wait will stretch to about 40. The official reason is never given. A technical issue, waiting for cargo, paperwork, none of the sources specify, and Lanhsa itself would later remain silent on the matter. Among the 15 passengers taking their seats is Aurelio Martinez. It's a name well known far beyond the borders of Honduras. Martinez is a musician, a performer of Garifuna music, the very sound that grew out of the Afro-Caribbean communities of Central America. He's recorded albums, toured Europe, represented Honduras as a diplomat, and served in the National Congress. Tonight, he's just a man flying home to the mainland. A few rows away from him sit Jairo Vargas and his wife, Seda Torres. Their story is the kind that leaves a lump in your throat. They are traveling to the department of Olancho to attend their own daughter's funeral. The last ferry from Roatán leaves at 2 in the afternoon, and they missed it. The only way to get to the mainland before morning is the evening Lanhsa flight. The plane, the same one with the engine that was acting up that morning, is now their only option. Another passenger, Yami Duarte, also missed that ferry. At 6:23 p.m., just a few minutes before the plane begins to taxi, she pulls out her phone and texts her sister, Darcy, on WhatsApp. "I'm on board." 2 blue check marks. Message delivered, message read. On the mainland, Darcy has already made dinner and called a taxi to meet her at the La Ceiba airport. A 25-minute flight, and her sister would be home. There's one more person whose name stands out in this story, precisely because she isn't here. Flight attendant Sarixa Rivera, a face known and loved by Lanhsa's regular passengers, was supposed to be working this flight, but her shift was changed at the last minute, and Rivera stayed on the ground. She would learn about what happened from the news, and would later write about it on Facebook. In total, there are 17 people on board, 2 pilots in the cockpit, and 15 passengers in the cabin. There is no flight attendant. That seat is empty. The door closes, and HR-AYW begins to taxi toward runway 07. In mid-March, at Roatán's latitude, the sun sets early, around 6:10, 6:15 in the evening. There's almost no tropical twilight here. The sun dips below the horizon, and within 20 to 30 minutes, it's dark. There's no gentle European-style fading. The light just switches off, like a flip of a switch. Flight 018 was supposed to depart at 5:40 p.m., a full half hour before sunset in broad daylight. The 40-minute delay pushes everything past that threshold. When the tower controller gives the crew clearance to line up on runway 07 at 6:24 p.m., dusk has already settled over the airport. The outlines of the hills to the west are still visible, but the horizon over the sea to the east, where the runway is pointing, is already dissolving into darkness. In another 10 minutes, the only way to tell the sea from the sky will be the lights of fishing boats. Meteorologically speaking, everything is clear. Visibility is good, the wind is light out of the north at 6 to 9 knots. The temperature is 27 degrees Celsius, with the pressure at 1017 hectopascals. The clouds are scattered, with the lowest layer at 2,200 feet. That's almost 700 meters, nothing dangerous. The mayor of Roatán, Ronnie McNabb Thompson, would later state it plainly. The weather that evening posed no threat whatsoever. But the change in light changes something else. The conditions for a rescue. During the day, you can see for tens of meters down into the clear Caribbean water. At night, in that same water, you can't even see your own hand in front of your face. During the day, a helicopter can hover over a spot and coordinate boats. At night, rescuers work with flashlights, by sound, by touch. This 40-minute difference between the scheduled and actual departure time, between light and darkness, still seems like a small detail. It won't for long. The crew receives takeoff clearance and pushes the engines to full power. HRAYW begins its takeoff roll down runway 07, heading toward the dark sea. What happens next lasts only a few seconds, but for the people in the cabin, those seconds stretch into an eternity. The plane gathers speed down runway 07, and at first, everything seems normal. The roar of the engines, the vibration of the fuselage, the familiar acceleration that presses you back into your seat. But somewhere midway through the takeoff roll, something changes. Liliana Estrada, one of the few who would survive, later recounted that the plane started to shake, but not in the way small turboprops usually do during takeoff. This was a different kind of shaking, stronger, wrong, and with it came an excessive noise that shouldn't have been there. Another survivor, whose name has not been released, describes the moment more specifically. During the acceleration, there's a loud bang from one of the engines. Not a gradual fade, not a whine or a whistle, but a sharp, sudden bang, as if something inside broke all at once. Which engine it was, left or right, this person can't say. From the passenger cabin of a Jetstream 32, both engines are located forward and to the sides. The sound comes from everywhere at once, making it nearly impossible to pinpoint the source. What exactly happened inside that engine? A compressor blade failure? A fuel controller malfunction? A turbine problem? Remains unknown to this day. The engines lie at the bottom of the Caribbean Sea and have never been examined by any specialist. In a normal situation, during the takeoff roll, the crew has a key decision to make: continue or abort. Up to a certain point, the so-called decision speed, the aircraft can still stop safely on the remaining length of the runway. After that speed, it's safer to take off than to brake. We don't know what speed HRAYW had reached at the moment of the bang. The flight recorders were never recovered, but we do know the result. The crew did not abort the takeoff. According to one of the survivors, the plane runs off the end of the runway, and yet somehow it gets airborne. What exactly runs off means, whether the aircraft used more runway than it should have, or if it veered sideways, is unclear. The wording is vague, and there's no one to clarify it. The people who were in the cockpit, watching the instruments, are gone. The wheels leave the ground, and HR-AYW is in the air over the Caribbean Sea with whatever thrust it has left. And this is where it becomes clear just how bad things are. A healthy Jetstream 32, after lifting off, climbs at a rate of over 2,000 feet per minute. That's about 10 meters per second. 30 seconds after liftoff, the aircraft should be at an altitude of 300 meters and still climbing confidently. HR-AYW does nothing of the sort. The plane lifts off the runway and just hangs there. The maximum altitude it reaches, according to the Honduran Civil Aviation Agency, AHAC, is between 20 and 35 feet. That's 6 to 11 meters, the height of a 3-story building. Instead of climbing, the plane is just crawling horizontally, just above the surface of the water, as if an invisible hand is pressing down on it, refusing to let it climb. 20 feet is not a flight altitude. It's an altitude from which there is no recovery. The crew has no margin for error, neither in height nor in speed. If something else goes wrong, and something is already deeply wrong, they have no room to maneuver, no seconds to think, no meters to dip the nose and gain speed. The The aircraft is flying on the razor's edge between flight and freefall, and that edge is thinner than a wing. Next, AHAC records another fact. The aircraft begins to veer to the right of the runway's extended centerline. This is a crucial detail because a rightward deviation during an engine failure is a classic sign of asymmetric thrust. If, for example, the left engine loses power while the right one continues at full throttle, the aircraft will yaw to the left, and the pilot has to counteract this with the rudder. If the rudder isn't powerful enough, or the speed is too low for the aerodynamic surfaces to be effective, the plane will pull toward the failed engine. A rightward deviation could indicate a problem with the right engine, or it could be the crew attempting to turn back toward the shore. Without the flight recorder data, it's impossible to know for sure. Jairo Vargas, the passenger flying to the funeral, who, in a few moments, will find himself in the water, would later describe these seconds. "It was in the air for just a minute, then I saw it falling to the right, where I was sitting." Vargas is seated on the right side of the plane, and he sees the world outside his window begin to tilt. In these seconds, not a single signal is transmitted on the airport tower's frequency. The crew doesn't transmit a mayday, the international distress signal indicating imminent danger. They don't transmit a pan-pan, the urgency signal for a serious problem without immediate danger. They transmit nothing at all. On the frequency 118.1 MHz, the last thing heard from Flight 018 was the confirmation of their takeoff clearance. 30 seconds after that confirmation, the communication goes silent, and the controller can no longer reach the aircraft. 30 seconds is the amount of time in which pilots physically cannot simultaneously fight to control an airplane and press the push-to-talk button on the yoke. When your aircraft is at 20 feet above the water, banking to one side and refusing to respond, both of your hands and all of your attention are focused on one thing, trying to keep it in the air. It's a fight the crew is about to lose. HR-AYW slams into the surface of the Caribbean Sea, 150 meters from the airport boundary. 150 meters, that's about the length of 1.5 football fields. People standing on the terminal's observation deck could see the point of impact if they knew where to look. But it's already dark, and most of the people inside the airport building will only learn of the crash from the sound it makes. Hitting the water at over 100 knots, the sea's surface doesn't act like a liquid. It acts like concrete. The fuselage splits in two. Eyewitnesses on the shore and in fishing boats see a flash and hear a bang. Fuel from the ruptured wing tanks ignites on impact, bathing the dark water in an orange glow for a few moments. The nose section, the cockpit, and the first few rows of the cabin sinks almost instantly. Both pilots remain in their seats, strapped in by their 4-point harnesses. Araya and Lagos never leave the cockpit, not because they don't want to, but because from the very first second of impact, the cockpit floods and plunges deep. Their bodies will be found later, just like that, in their seats, still in their harnesses, inside the flooded cockpit. The tail section behaves differently. It's lighter, it has a different geometry, and after the breakup, it stays on the surface for about 5 more minutes. 5 minutes, it's both an eternity and no time at all. Long enough for some passengers in that section to have a chance of reaching the surface, not long enough for a single rescue service to make it to the scene. The impact rips the fuselage open, throwing passengers from the middle of the cabin out into the open. They find themselves in the warm Caribbean water, in the dark, many of them unconscious. And this is where a detail emerges that will be repeated in every rescuer's account. People are floating upside down. The lap belts they were wearing at the moment of impact are holding them by the hips, while their upper bodies hang down into the water. Those who are conscious can try to unbuckle their belts. Those who are unconscious are just hanging there, face down, with every second working against them. The depth of the sea at the crash site is a question that, even a year later, has no single answer. In its preliminary report, AHAC states 50 to 60 meters. Other sources, including dive surveys from 2026, say 30 meters. The difference is huge. 30 meters is accessible to any qualified diver, while 60 requires special equipment and decompression procedures. Whichever number is correct, one thing is certain. Anything that sinks is going where it can't be reached at night. And it's at this very moment, when all seems lost, that 2 men who have nothing to do with aviation enter the story. Eduardo Orellana and Aldair Aleman are fishermen. That evening, they're in their boats about 100 meters from where flight HR-AYW goes down. They aren't waiting for a plane, they're not watching the takeoff, they're just fishing in the warm waters off the southern coast of Roatán like they do every evening. A flash, the sound of impact, and a few seconds later, voices. Orellana would later tell reporters from Paya magazine, "We saw the tail of the plane and heard people calling for help. The fishermen start their engines and are at the scene in a matter of minutes. They're the first ones there, before the police, before the fire department, before the military. They have no rescue equipment, no thermal imagers, no searchlights. What they have are flashlights, their bare hands, and their fishing knives, and it's those knives that end up saving lives." Orellana and Alemán arrive at the scene and see something that's impossible to process at first glance. In the black water, illuminated only by their flashlight beams, are people floating, and many of them are hanging face down, held by their belts at the hips. The fishermen start turning over bodies, checking for breath, cutting the belts, and pulling people into their boats. It's a job you can never be prepared for. Orellana would later sum it up in a single sentence. "In my boat, I picked up 4 alive and 4 dead." The airport fire department, whose base is literally just over the fence from the runway, only arrives on the water 20 minutes later. The Honduran Navy, after 30. A boat from the nearby Anthony's Key Resort shows up around the same time. By the time the professional rescuers get to the scene, the fishermen have already done the most important work, pulling those who could still be saved from the water. There are 5 of them, all passengers. Among them is Liliana Estrada, who would later tell journalists from Tu Nota that the last thing she remembers is water all around her and the light of the fishermen's flashlights. Doctors would later tell her that her spinal injuries missed the point of paralysis by just 5 centimeters. 5 centimeters, the width of 2 fingers, was the difference between walking and never walking again. Also among the rescued is Jairo Vargas, who was flying to his daughter's funeral with his wife. Vargas is alive. His wife, Seda Torres, is not. He'll find out on the shore, soaked in the dark, surrounded by people he's never seen before. 12 people out of 17 will not return home that evening, 2 pilots and 10 passengers. Among them is Aurelio Martinez, a musician known throughout Honduras. Among them is Yemi Duarte, whose phone with her last message, "I'm on board," now lies at the bottom of the sea. At 18:43, 20 minutes after that message was sent, her sister Darcy will text her on WhatsApp. "Have you landed yet?" Beneath the message, a single gray check mark, "Not delivered." The night of March 17th into the 18th on the southern shore of Roatán never really ends. While the survivors are taken to the hospital, a very different kind of work continues on the water. Military and police boats scan the area with searchlights. Divers try to descend to the wreckage, but the darkness and depth make any dive impossible until dawn. By midnight, 11 bodies have been recovered from the surface and the surf zone. The 12th person isn't on the surface, which means they're still somewhere inside the sunken fuselage, on the seabed. The search operation is suspended until morning. Roatán is a resort island, and at night, its waterfronts are usually filled with music from the bars. But this night, the southern shore looks different. Police tape, flashing red and blue lights, and families waiting for news, standing on the sand. On the morning of March 18th, divers finally descend to the wreckage. The fuselage is lying on the seabed, upside down, its landing gear pointing up like an overturned toy. Inside the shattered hull, they find the last victim, Nydia Meralda Benitez. More than 15 hours have passed from the moment of impact until her recovery. 15 hours during which she remained alone, inside a flooded machine in the darkness of the Caribbean seabed. Honduras wakes up on the morning of March 18th to a different reality. The news of Flight 018's crash is on the front page of every national newspaper. Aurelio Martinez, whose name is known to every Honduran closer to the Caribbean coast than the Pacific, is dead. His Garifuna music was heard at international festivals from London to New York. His face was familiar from diplomatic receptions and album covers. Now, it's on memorial posters. And on the phone of Darcy, Yemi Duarte's sister, that unanswered message with its single gray checkmark is still there. The flight was supposed to take 25 minutes. A day has passed, and a reply will never come. Now begins the part of the story that's supposed to provide answers. Instead, it only creates more questions. The investigation into the crash of Flight 018 is formally opened by HAC, the Agencia Hondureña de Aeronáutica Civil, the Honduran Civil Aviation Agency. Under international rules, the investigation is led by the country where the crash occurred. That country is Honduras. That agency is AHAC. And right away, a problem arises that will haunt the entire investigation from start to finish. AHAC is both the regulator that issued Lanhsa's operating permit and certified HRAYW as airworthy. And now, it's the very same agency tasked with finding out why that certified plane crashed. The investigator and a potential accomplice, all in one. On March 20th, 3 days after the crash, a team of 4 British specialists from BAE Systems arrives on Roatán, the successor to the very same British Aerospace that built this Jetstream 35 years ago. The team is handpicked for a specific task: a fuselage structure expert who leads the group, an instrument specialist, an engine technician, and an avionics engineer. 4 people, 4 fields of expertise, exactly what you need to get to the bottom of this. The British team works for about a week. They conduct an inspection, take measurements, study what's accessible from the surface and with underwater cameras, and then they leave. Without the wreckage, without the cockpit voice recorder, without the engines. All of it remains on the seabed. Why the team didn't arrange for the recovery of at least the CVR, the cockpit voice recorder, a key piece of evidence in any aviation investigation, is never explained. They just get on a plane and fly back to the United Kingdom. At the same time, the NTSB, the National Transportation Safety Board from the United States, gets involved. Their role is predetermined. Once the voice recorder is finally recovered, it's the NTSB's lab in Washington that will analyze the recording. When is the operative word here, because for now, the recorder is still sitting inside that overturned fuselage, somewhere between 30 and 60 meters deep, and no one seems to be in a hurry to get it out. On April 25th, more than 5 weeks after the crash, AHAC releases its preliminary report. The document outlines the sequence of events: the takeoff roll, the climb to 20 or 35 feet, the rightward deviation, the impact with the water, but it doesn't name a cause. Not a probable one, not a suspected one, not even a working theory. The wording sounds like a placeholder. Probable causes will be announced in the final report. And this same preliminary report contains a detail that says a lot about the quality of the investigation itself. In the section describing the aircraft, AHAC lists the engine type for HR-AYW as TSIO-3-6-0-EB. Anyone with even a passing familiarity with aviation would recognize that designation as a continental piston engine, the kind you'd find on a light, single-engine Cessna or Piper. That's the equivalent of writing in a truck crash report that the vehicle was powered by a bicycle engine. The Jetstream 32 is equipped with Honeywell TPE 331 turboprops. That's a completely different class of engine, with a whole different way of working and a different level of power. This isn't a minor detail. It's a fundamental error in the description of the very machine they're investigating. After publishing the report, AHAC takes another step, one that, under normal circumstances, would be seen as an admission of a problem. The agency recuses itself from the investigation. The reason? A conflict of interest. AHAC was the one who issued Lanhsa certificates, the one who inspected the aircraft, the one who oversaw the airport. Investigating your own potential mistakes means being the judge in your own case. The case is handed over to the Accident Investigation Commission of the Secretariat of National Defense, SEDENA, a military body instead of a civil aviation regulator, an unusual move that raises questions all on its own. Meanwhile, the aircraft remains at the bottom of the Caribbean Sea. With each passing week, the saltwater corrosion does its work, marine organisms cover the metal, and the chances of recovering anything useful from the wreckage slowly but surely diminish. Summer passes, fall comes and goes, winter arrives, and the aircraft, serial number 863, is still lying on the seabed. By February of 2026, 11 months after the crash, the investigation looks as if no one is even conducting it. The cockpit voice recorder, the one device that could tell us what the pilots were saying in their final seconds, whether they heard any alarms, whether they tried to do anything, has not been recovered. The flight data recorder, which tracks speed, altitude, control surface positions, and engine performance, if one was even installed on the 35-year-old machine, also hasn't been recovered. The engines, which need to be taken apart in a lab to understand exactly what failed, remain underwater, untouched by any specialist. Underwater photos taken in early 2026 and published by the Honduran newspapers El Heraldo and La Prensa show something that looks more like a coral reef than an airplane. The fuselage is covered in a layer of biological deposits. Algae, barnacles, and corals are beginning to colonize the metal. The sea is slowly digesting the evidence, and with every passing month, the odds of retrieving anything useful from this wreckage get smaller and smaller. The final investigation report is promised by March 17, 2026, exactly 1 year after the crash. AHAC's Deputy Director, Jorge Corrales McCarthy, announces this date publicly in an interview with La Prensa. But how can you write a final report on the cause of a crash when the primary evidence, the black boxes and the engines, has never even been examined? It's like delivering a verdict in a case where not a single envelope of evidence has been opened. Alongside the aviation inquiry, there's a criminal investigation. On June 3, 2025, the Special Prosecutor's Office for Crimes Against Life raids the Lanhsa offices in Ceiba. Investigators seize documents and question employees. What exactly they find remains unknown. By October of 2025, the prosecutor's office has not offered a single comment to the press on the progress of the investigation. Journalists from La Prensa try to get information and hit a wall of silence. And this is where the people the state seems to have forgotten enter the story. The families of the victims. Frustrated by months of inaction, they decide to do what not a single Honduran agency has done. Through the Texas law firm DJC Law, which is handling their lawsuit, the families hire Grupo Hispano, a private diving company from San Pedro Sula, specializing in deep water operations. The plan is to organize their own expedition to the wreckage in early 2026 and recover what the state couldn't, or wouldn't. Private citizens using their own money are hiring private divers to retrieve evidence for an investigation being conducted by the state. That one sentence captures the entire essence of what has happened to the investigation of Flight 018. As long as the wreckage of HRAYW remains underwater, the exact cause of the crash isn't a difficult puzzle to solve. It's a puzzle no one has seriously tried to piece together. The only thing in this story that happens quickly is the shutdown of the airline. On April 2, 2025, just 16 days after the crash, AHAC suspends Lanhsa's air operator certificate. The planes are grounded, the crews are sent home, and tickets are canceled. For the thousands of residents of Honduras's Caribbean islands, who for years had relied on Lanhsa flights as their only quick way to the mainland, this means a return to ferries and hours-long journeys on crumbling roads. The airline, which had been operating since 2011, simply ceases to exist. The certificate isn't just suspended, it's revoked. The legal machine, unlike the investigative one, moves considerably faster. The victims' families find a lawyer in Texas, Andres Pereira of the firm DJC Law. Pereira isn't just a lawyer specializing in aviation disasters. He's a licensed pilot himself, a man who understands the difference between a piston and a turboprop engine, and who can read AHAC's preliminary report and see what any aviation professional would see: glaring errors and gaping holes. An international lawsuit is filed on behalf of Aurelio Martinez's widow, Rohana Romero, and the families of other victims. Honduran President Xiomara Castro responds to the disaster by creating a special commission and announcing an audit of the country's entire regional aviation sector. Fine words and the right gestures. But an audit checks what's happening now. And 12 people died because of what happened yesterday. Because of decisions that were made or not made over a period of years. And this is where we should pause and take stock of what we still don't know. Which of the two engines failed that evening, the left or the right, is unknown. What caused the failure, a turbine disintegration, a fuel supply problem, a defect that had built up over 35 years of service, is unknown. What Araya and Lagos said to each other in the 30 seconds between takeoff clearance and impact with the water is unknown because the recorder is still at the bottom of the sea. That repair in Puerto Lempira on the morning of March 17th, did it fix the problem or did it create a new one? We don't know because no one has examined the maintenance record or the engines themselves. But we do know something else. We know that for years, Luis Angel Araya had been saying out loud what many pilots in similar situations prefer to keep to themselves. He refused to fly planes he considered unsafe. He put his career on the line to be heard. His friend, Fausto Molina, confirms this on camera. His wife, Claudia Sanchez, confirms it in an interview. The captain had warned them, again and again. And yet, on March 17th, 2025, after that morning call to his wife about the engine trouble, after a 30-minute field repair on the edge of the jungle, after 3 successful flights in a row on the very same plane, he still took the left seat, pushed the engines to take off power, and began his roll down runway 07. Why he flew that 4th time is a question only the black box can answer, and that black box is lying at the bottom of the Caribbean Sea, 150 meters from the runway, inside the inverted fuselage of a 35-year-old airplane.